Superman itself is the symbol of force, power, and violence.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedman.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, it's well known that Jewish creators and publishers created the comic book industry in the United States. Less well known is that the industry was almost destroyed by a Jewish psychiatrist.
We're excited to talk with Harold Schechter, a true crime author and professor emeritus at Queens College, whose latest graphic biography is Dr. Werthless, illustrated and co-written by Eric Powell. Harold, welcome to Amusing Jews.
Pleasure to be here.
Would you tell us a little bit about yourself, Harold, and your background?
Well, I was born in the Bronx in 1948. And grew up in the 50s, heyday of the horror comics. I became a professor of American literature, which I taught for 42 years, mostly at Queens College, one of the senior branches of the City University of New York. My specialty was 19th century Gothic American literature. Growing up in the 50s, I, like all my contemporaries, were just bombarded with horror stuff. The popular culture was just pervaded with monsters. The classic Universal monster movies were first being shown on TV. They had these Friday night creature feature shows. In New York, there was one whose host was Zachary the Cool Ghoul. I spent or misspent pretty much every Saturday morning going to a double feature of horror films in my neighborhood theater. There were all the great EC horror comics. So horror has always been a very, very important part of my imaginative life. And when I became an academic and a scholar, I became very interested in why we all need stories about monsters. What psychological function does horror serve? And at some point, I decided I needed to supplement my meager academic salary by doing some commercial writing. I had done, writing before that. It was mostly academic writing to get tenure and promotion and so on. And I was really writing books about whatever interested me at the moment. And at some point I did a book called Film Tricks, which was a history of special effects in the movies. It literally ended with the original Star Wars. So it was just before the CGI revolution. But when I was doing the chapter on horror, I came across the fact that both Psycho and Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which were my two favorite horror movies, had both been inspired by this actual case, that of Ed Gein, a farmer who lived in a small Wisconsin town called Plainfield. He wasn't really a serial killer, although he did kill a couple of women. He was basically a necrophile who would study the local obituaries and go out to the graveyard at night when some elderly woman who reminded him of his deceased mother had just been buried, dig up the corpse, bring it back to his decrepit farmhouse and dissect it, make different things out of the body parts, including a skin suit, which is then where Thomas Harris got the idea for the Buffalo Bill character in Silence of the Lambs. When I wrote that book, I immodestly thought I was creating a new literary genre because I thought of it not as true crime, but as true horror. Because I recognized that, there were certain criminals whose crimes, seem like these fairy tale or folklore monsters come to life. And the nicknames they got in the press often reflected that. Like Dean was called the Ghoul of Plainfield and so on and so forth. So I was very interested. My feeling was that when you're a kid, you need all these monster fairy tales and monster movies. At some point you outgrow that. But what these real life monsters kind of serve that function for grown-ups. So anyway, Deviant did well. My publisher gave me excellent advice, which was if I wanted to have a career as a writer, I needed to pigeonhole myself. And somehow writing about psychopathic sex murder seemed congenial to my temperament. Anyway, one thing led to another. And before you knew it, I was a true crime writer specializing mostly in this. I think of myself as a true crime historian, because I write mostly about these very sensational cases, many of which have been totally forgotten about. Simultaneously, I was also a very serious comic book collector. I had a huge, very valuable collection, which I ultimately had to sell to pay for my second divorce. It's still painful for me to contemplate that. I keep trying to tell myself, well, if I hadn't sold them, I wouldn't have had my children. But then I keep thinking,
I appreciate what you're saying about the real life monsters and the way that the press gives them these names. When I was a kid, the one who was creeping around the LA area was the Night Stalker. Just a perfect name for a monster.
oh yeah, well, I wrote a book called The Serial Killer Files, and one section of it just had to do with all the nicknames. My second book was about this, what many people consider the most heinous serial killer in the annals of American crime, Albert Fish. He was known as the werewolf of Wisteria. And I'm writing a book now about a serial killer from the 1890s, who was called the Demon of the Belfry. So, these supernatural nicknames are always attached to these figures.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
Frederick Wertham was a Jewish German-born psychiatrist who studied heinous crimes and criminal behavior. You show that he tended to be compassionate and understanding toward the criminals he studied, but prickly and aggressive toward his colleagues. Why do you think that was?
Wertham, as so many of us are, was a very complicated man. One of the reasons Eric and I did the book was to, in the world of comicdom, Wertham is like this arch villain, totally vilified. When you study his life and his career, you see there's much, much more to him than that. And much of what he did was really admirable. I'd known about Wertham since I was, probably about 13 or so, when I came across his book, Seduction of the Innocent. But once I started writing my books, Wertham was a very prominent figure in two of the true crime books I wrote. He was called in to examine Albert Fish. As I said, Fish was this cannibalistic, pedophiliac sadist, who spent his life horribly torturing children and also subjecting himself to incredible kinds of torture because he was a masochist. And then another book I wrote called The Mad Sculptor dealt with a triple murderer named Robert Irwin. Wertham also treated him. So I had done a lot of research into Wertham, before Eric and I embarked on this project. And I knew, again, that he had done, this really important work, especially in the area of civil rights. One of his accomplishments, he worked with Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright to open the first psychiatric clinic in Harlem, offering treatment, to these inner city inhabitants for a quarter a session, and if they couldn't afford that, for free. He was very instrumental in the civil rights movement, helping Brown versus Board of Education to get passed. So I knew all that stuff about him. But in answer to your question, his personality could be a little grating. He had this Germanic imperiousness about him. And he basically was pretty much convinced that he was always in the right. So in his professional relationships with colleagues, he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But at the same time, he was in many ways a very progressive person. People think of him, and my earliest impression of him was that he was like Carrie Nation, this hatchet-wielding blue nose, who was all for censoring stuff. But in fact, he was not censorious at all. He testified on behalf, back then in the 1950s, if you were a man who wanted a skin rag, you got these nudist magazines, which showed women and men, full frontal nudity. They were always, they were published as health magazines. And some guy was being prosecuted for sending on obscenity charges for sending through the mail. And, Wertham defended him. He didn't say anything obscene about just showing a naked man and woman. When Elvis Presley first arrived on the scene, it was like civilization was coming to an end. Wertham, saw nothing wrong with Presley. He thought it was kind of a healthy outlet for adolescents. But he was very fixated on violence, particularly juvenile violence. And largely because of his training, he was thoroughly versed in Freudian psychoanalysis, but he'd also trained under a psychiatrist named Adolf Meyer at the Phipps Clinic in Johns Hopkins, who in a way was less interested, in the infantile repressed complexes that Freud focused on than on the environmental and sociological causes of, mental illness. And Wertham was kind of a utopian. He didn't believe unlike me, he didn't believe human beings are innately violent. He believed that if you removed all these harmful societal influences, murder and violence could essentially be eliminated. So at some point, when he was actually treating some young black kids at Lafargue, who, their behavior had become very disruptive, sometimes violent. One common denominator he felt was that they were all reading these violent crime and horror comic books. And he became convinced that there was a major factor in the cause of juvenile delinquency.
It seems that every era has a popular media target to blame for juvenile delinquency, whether it's dime novels, radio, movies, television, video games, or something else. Why were comics specifically such a major target in Wertham's day?
Well, yes, you're totally right about that. I wrote a whole book about it called Savage Pastimes, A Cultural History of Violent Entertainment. Every time a new medium of popular entertainment appears, particularly one that's aimed at children, again, you get all these blue-nosed critics claiming, that it's corrupting the youth of America. As you say, it starts at least as far back as 19th century time novels. It goes all the way through, as you say, radio, TV, movies, then violent video games and so on. Two things are important to understand, putting this anti-comics crusade into context. One, it didn't begin with Wertham. It had actually been going on long before that. Two, there was kind of a moral panic at the time about juvenile delinquency. There was a poll taken sometime in the 50s in which, the American public ranked juvenile delinquency second only to open-air atomic bomb testing, as a public menace. And three, comic book fans hate him because he killed off the EC horror comic book line. But the EC horror comic line was really to call it the creme de la creme is an understand. I mean, 99% of the comic crime and horror comics were incredibly sadistic and disturbing. And I mean, they were trash. They were just exploitive trash. And there were images there that you would not want to expose your kids to. Now, whether, the kind of contradictory thing about Wertham was, even though he had a very sophisticated understanding of the workings of human psychology, he, at the same time, and I think through his work with Adolf Meyer, had a little bit of a monkey see, simplistic monkey see, monkey do, view when it came to the relationship between these comics and, young developing minds. So, yeah, but I mean, if you look at some of the comics, not that he sees, he reproduces these panels, showing women being stabbed in the eyeball with ice picks and, other women strapped to tables, having their blood drained out of them. And the famous Crime Does Not Pay comic book where some thug is shoving a woman's face down on the stove burner.
Of course, the EC horror comics were also morally poignant. They had a kind of a message to them. They weren't just violence for violence sake, as you're saying. I think also, though, he targeted other kinds of comics, even funny animal comics and superhero comics and everything else.
Yeah, he did. I mean, he targeted, Superman, for example. Again, this is coming out of World War II. So the figure of the Ubermensch, had a lot of baggage attached to it. He also argued, perhaps not totally invalidly, that there was some homoerotic aspects, to the relationship between Batman and Robin. Again, that's perfectly valid in a way. I mean, there's a homoerotic element to Huckleberry Finn and Moby Dick.
Or David and Jonathan in the Bible.
Yeah. Again, he carried it a little too far. His whole thing was, well, this is going to encourage kids to become homosexual. So that was his real intellectual failing.
During the Senate subcommittee to investigate juvenile delinquency, Wertham insisted that he opposed censorship, and he did, in fact, take public stances against censorship. How do you square that with his censorial position on comics?
I mean, you see again and again in his work, his open-mindedness. For example, in the what we came across, Eric and I, when we researched in the Library of Congress, came across this correspondence he had with this very tormented gay guy. And, he was very reassuring to him, and saw nothing, urged the guy to stop torturing himself over this stuff. And as I said, yeah, I mean, he was totally against censorship, but he was so fixated on violence and the causes of violence. Inevitably, really, I mean, anybody who's going to treat Albert Fish is going to, somehow, a psychiatrist examining somebody like Fish or Robert Irwin is bound to become a little preoccupied, if not obsessed, with the question of where such behavior comes from. And again, given Wertham's interest in these external factors, when he ultimately became aware that some of these very disturbed kids he was treating, kept talking about these violent comic books, he just put those two things together. And again, it was a correlation. Mad Magazine made fun of that. It's like, well, they also watch baseball games, why not, whatever. But the comic books made an obvious target, because they were the crime and horror comics, excluding EC. They were really, really not suitable for children. In fact, they weren't suitable for anybody.
Today, Frederick Wertham is synonymous with the comic book alarmism of the 1950s. Would you describe his efforts as well-meaning, misguided, ill-intentioned, or maybe all of the above?
I don't think it was ill-intentioned. I think Wertham's intentions were always, pretty honorable in a way. I mean, he was wrong. Yeah, I would use the word misguided in that, in terms of that. Wertham had a weird relationship with comic books, because even, much later, as you know, when we talk about the book, he became very, very fascinated by zines, dealing with comic books. I mean, I have I, I'm capable of playing armchair psychologist myself. I have a very Freudian-based theory about Wertham, which was that he was actually kind of attracted to all, he was so uptight in a lot of ways. And his life was so focused on high culture, coming from this background that he came from. And he was married to a well-known sculptor. And, they had this big art collection. There was something about this lowbrow, titillating trash, I think, that actually appealed to him in a way. And he was so horrified by that he defended against it, by launching this, by spearheading this campaign. But again, that's just my armchair psychoanalytic reading.
I was thinking the same thing as I was reading your book, that, and I think it's conveyed in the artwork and in much of the descriptions, that he was attracted to this material and it scared him, and he projected that, whatever was going on inside of him onto the general culture, and assumed that, all the millions of kids who are reading comic books were having the same experience.
Ironically, Dr. Wertham's own books, including his comic book diatribe Seduction of the Innocent and The Show of Violence, a collection of crime cases he was involved with, were excessively sensational in a way that mirrored what he criticized in comics. Did his desire for fame interfere with his professionalism?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, Wertham really enjoyed being a public intellectual. He really basked in the limelight. The books you mentioned, for example, I mean, the first time I ever heard about Albert Fish was from his book, Show of Violence. Same thing with Robert Irwin. So, yeah, I mean, there is something, I wouldn't call it hypocritical, but paradoxical, that he was writing these books, which were offered, again, as psychological explanations, for why such criminal behavior exists, but at the same time, we're offering this sensational true crime stuff to readers. I mean, when I was reading it, I was reading it because, so transfixed, by the horrors of what Albert Fish did, not so much Wertham's analysis of his psychology. So, again, complicated man. He felt, and he was always kind of an outsider in the academic and professional psychological community. Many of his colleagues, and not just his psychiatric colleagues, but a lot of the intelligentsia at the time, kind of dismissed a lot of his theories. So, he compensated in a way, by pursuing the role of the celebrated public intellectual, which only further undermined his, academic credibility. But, that was a trade-off.
He wanted to kind of make a splash through the sensationalism in a popular medium as well, which, again, seems contradictory.
Well, I mean, he obviously didn't think of it as sensationalism. He was they were basically memoirs of the cases he had dealt with. And, he dealt with some and not only Fisher and Irwin, he was the head of the psychiatric clinic at Bellevue at the time when New York City had this law that every convicted felon had to undergo a psychiatric examination, and the report submitted to the sentencing judge, who would take that into account before he, uh, you know, leveled the sentence. So, he was familiar with these very lurid crimes, and his books were offered, kind of as a memoir, his encounter with these criminals and his treatment of them. So he didn't think of it as sensationalism, but their main attraction, was, of course, which to some extent he had to know, exactly the titillating nature of what he was describing. So,
I mean, it seems like there's kind of a fine line between, lurid details and sensationalism. And the beginning of the book was also, a little bit sensationalized.
well, the beginning of the book was based on, a book I wrote. I wrote a book called Fiend about Jesse Pomeroy, the Boston boy fiend. His story is one that serves as a kind of prologue. And the point of that was, as we mentioned earlier, just to demonstrate, how, these guardians of public morality, would be quick to blame, some form of popular media on, juvenile criminality. Again, back then it was supposedly, Jesse Palmer is a, adolescent serial sex killer. And, after he was arrested, these people came out and claimed because he'd read too many violent dime novels. So, that is there. I am all for sensationalism, by the way. I don't feel my writing per se is sensationalistic, in my books. But I totally acknowledge that the subjects I write that are sensational. And, I think sensationalism, is a perfectly valid form of entertainment.
Yeah, it was a really effective way, I think, to get us into Wertham's world, because I think in general we have this image of him as the comic book killer, the killer of comics, I should say. But, you're really steeping us in that really horrific world that he studied. And it did help us, I think, as readers make sense of why he was so adamant about uh, ridding the world of sensationalized horror.
Most of the uh, real censors uh, in our history really have been Puritans, who felt anything, that might stimulate pleasure was evil. And that was not Wertham at all. He was strictly fixated on the causes of juvenile violence and on violence and, murder and violence in general, which his experience as a psychiatrist had, immersed him in. And as I said earlier, there's something almost touchingly naive about Wertham for all his sophistication in his belief that violence and murder and war could be eliminated from human society. If these environmental and societal factors were identified and corrected.
What surprised you most while piecing together Dr. Wertham's complicated life and legacy?
Well, again, I had known about the Lafargue Clinic, for example, but I was not aware of his very deep involvement in the civil rights movement until Eric and I went through his papers at the Library of Congress, and we found these letters from Thurgood Marshall thanking him. And, so his very important work on civil rights that I hadn't known about. So I would have to say that was, the single most significant thing. But, again, all these other things we found that really humanized him, the correspondence with a gay guy, for example, and letters in which he actually had a sense of humor that occasionally manifested itself. When he hung up, that Whollywood Dr. Werthless thing in his home, he kind of treasured that. He was little able to laugh at himself, and that came through in some of his correspondence. So, so those were the main things.
Yeah, I think your book does help us to understand him as worth something.
In one recent interview, I said comic book fans should really be grateful to him, because if it hadn't been for Wertham, there wouldn't have been Robert Crumb. There wouldn't have been that whole reaction in the late 60s and 70s, against the restrictions of the comic book industry, that produced all the great underground comics. So you got to take the long view.
Well, thank you so much, Harold, for joining us.
Well, thank you for inviting me on. It was a delight.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.